So what exactly is a dry fly and a wet fly, or a nymph and a streamer? I mean, you might have a box of flies and you might not know what they are. You might be in a fly shop and you're confused by these rows and rows and rows of flies. I'm gonna go through the basic types of flies to give you an idea of how to identify them and when you might use them. Let's start with a dry fly. You can usually tell if something is a dry fly because it usually looks kind of light and airy, and they often have what's called hackle, but they float by being pinioned in the surface film. They're all heavier. Most of them actually are heavier than water, although some flies tied with foam will actually float on their own. But they're mostly pinioned in the surface film, and they're pretty easy to identify. This parachute Adams is actually a classic dry fly. You use these when the fish are rising, obviously when you see fish feeding on the surface, or if the water is relatively clear and you think there might be a chance that a fish might see your fly floating by. So pretty straightforward. That's a dry fly, and they come in all kinds of sizes from this big to teeny tiny, and you use the right size and pattern based on the conditions or based on what your guide tells you. Next is nymphs, and nymphs imitate some sort of subsurface fly. It could be a worm, it could be a nymph or an immature stage of a mayfly or a stonefly or a caddisfly. It might look like a damselfly nymph. It might look like a little crayfish or some kind of grub, but they're flies that you use underwater, and often they have a bead on the head of them. Often they have a brass or a tungsten bead which helps them sink and adds a little attraction. But when you look at them, they don't look like they're gonna float. They don't have that fuzzy look that a dry fly has, and they look like some kind of larva. So that's a nymph, and you use nymphs when you don't see fish feeding on the surface. Fish do about 80% of their feeding underwater, so a lot of us rely on nymphs lots of the time. And again, they can be from quite large to very tiny, depending on the preference of the fish. And sometimes you just have to try different sizes and patterns and see what works. Now there's another kind of sinking fly which is a little bit more old-fashioned, that's still used a lot today. It's called a wet fly. And wet flies are usually, they don't have any added weight. They usually don't have any beads or anything. And so they don't sink quite as quickly as a nymph. And you often swing wet flies in the current by casting them across and letting them swing in the current. They sometimes have wings, like this hare's ear fly is a very classic, old-fashioned, it's hundreds of years old, still works today. That's one type of wet fly. And another type of wet fly is what's called soft hackle. And they have fuzzy hackle up front, but they don't have wings. They don't have the matched wings that a wet fly has. And again, you use these when you don't see fish feeding on the surface, and you just swing them in the current and see if a fish takes them. The last type of fly that you'll encounter is a streamer fly. The streamer flies imitate bait fish, they imitate crayfish, they imitate leeches. It's a larger food form that's going to be swimming on its own usually. So they're actively retrieved through the water. And often you catch very large fish with these because bigger fish eat bigger food items. They can be as big as this, which is a double hooked down and dirty, which imitates a large bait fish or a small trout. Trout do eat their young. They can be smaller to imitate a small sculpin or a small leech, but they're typically fished active in the water. You're stripping line and you're making this thing swim through the water. So how do I identify them? Well, they're usually fairly long and skinny and bigger than a nymph or a wet fly. Not every day is a good streamer day. Generally dark days, rainy days, the bigger fish are gonna be out prowling around looking for frogs or leeches or bait fish, bigger food items. So they don't work as well on sunny days, but try a streamer anytime, you never know. So all of these different types of flies, you never know what fly is going to work, and there is no magic fly. You got to go out and you got to experiment. You listen to your guide, you go online and you see what's been working, or you just go out there and experiment and try different types. That's the fun of fly fishing, is trying all these different types of flies.